The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 16th chapter. Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? And he answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, how much do you owe? And he replied, 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and make it 80. And he said, and his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters. For a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. The gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Grace, peace, and mercy are yours from the triune God. A few years ago, while I was in seminary, I worked at a music venue checking IDs at the door. And one night during after hours, which means that the bar was closed, it was probably around 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was after a relatively uneventful night. The bar staff and some of the locals, who are our friends, were hanging out, having a couple of beers. And one of the locals there happened to also be a drug dealer. And he asked me if I wanted to do a line of coke with him, and I politely declined. Now, I was sort of new at the bar. I just started working there a couple months ago, and so we didn't really know each other very well. So he was trying to make friends and make sure that I was all right. So he offered me what he had. The man grew up in El Salvador, and he was a member of a gang here in town, and he had some tattoos on his face, and by all accounts, he may not have been the safest person to make angry. And again, I was very new. So when I declined his offer, he got a little suspicious of me. He looked at my friend Dave, and he had gotten me the job, and he had been around a lot longer than me, so they had trust. And he asked Dave who I was. His voice raised, and he started wondering if I was a cop. It was kind of intense for a little bit. And I said, no, I'm not a cop. And his look kind of tilted at me a little bit, and still with great confusion, suspicions, and maybe a little bit of anger, because people don't turn down drugs very often there, especially when you are trying to make friends with people. He asked, what are you then, like a priest or something? And yeah, that's what I did. And me and my friend Dave looked at each other and started laughing, which didn't help the situation. And I said, oh yeah, I mean, kind of, sort of. And I explained that I was going to seminary and I was going to be a Lutheran pastor or a priest, for all intents and purposes to him. And he looked at me and of course didn't believe me, because there aren't very many priests hanging out at the bar at 3 o'clock in the morning, and said, that's really great. And he started to get a little teary. And he said to me that while growing up in El Salvador during the revolution, the priests were always very good to him and his friends. They were one of the only people with authority that stood up and fought against the government. He was a teenager in 1989 when 6 priests and their housekeepers were killed in El Salvador after they stood with the poor and the oppressed and spoke against the government who was taking advantage of its people. And he and I were always good after that. The act of those faithful Christians gave him respect for me that I did not earn, and his experience taught me that he understood what a Christian discipleship is supposed to look like. And I loved him in return. In the text today, there is this manager of an estate, and the owner of the estate calls him into his office. He doesn't like how the manager has been managing, and he says to the manager that the manager has been squandering the landowner's money. Now, I don't know what that means, but he gets fired, or he knows he's going to be soon. He will have no place soon in the landowner's house. So worried about how he is going to be taking care of himself now that he will be without a cushy job that skims the top off of loans, and because he is too weak to dig and too ashamed to beg, the manager forgives huge chunks of people's loans. Now, at this time, the common practice with loans was to give loans, but with great interest on them, sometimes 20%, even 50%. So if you want to get a business going, or you're a farmer, or something happens to you, you simply need money, you go and get a loan and expect to pay a whole lot more than what you took the loan out for. Which is, of course, great if you are the person lending the money and getting back all that interest on money that was not yours. Or in this case, if you are working for the person lending the money, like a manager or a steward. The reason the manager forgives huge chunks of these loans is because people didn't like loan collectors. Imagine somebody taking your money and charging you a whole lot more for it. It was understood that lenders of these loans were getting rich off of the hard work of others. And of course, you and I can look at each other and say, well, the people taking out the loan knew what they were getting themselves into. They signed the contract. They knew the expectation, and they should have known what they would have to pay back, a loan with great interest. But these loans at that great of an interest, they are just not fair. They are unjust. And so the manager tries to make right because he's going to lose his job anyway and makes friends while he still can. That's the story. And now we often feel like this parable of the dishonest manager is a parable about the manager being dishonest with the landowner's money. After all, he is giving away great chunks of his money, or what should, according to the contract that everybody entered into, be his money after the people pay him back with interest. But remember, this manager, who we automatically assumed is being dishonest with the landowner's money, is only forgiving 20 or 50% of the loans. The manager is forgiving their interest. He isn't giving away the landowner's money. He is just not making the people pay for the money. He's not charging them interest. He is actually being pretty fair. He is actually acting with justice. I think this parable would be better titled "The Manager Who Was Once Dishonest." Anytime we read these parables where there is a master or a vineyard owner or a king, or in this case, a landowner, we jump to the conclusion and try and puzzle together what is going on. And we assign God, who is powerful, to the most powerful position, right? In this case, that's the landowner. And sometimes that works for us, but in this case, I just don't think it does, because the landowner is getting rich off of the people's misery, which doesn't seem very godlike. Instead, I kind of wonder if this parable isn't teaching us about how to treat one another with the justice and love of God to ensure that God is in our own relationships. The word that is translated in English here as dishonest is often translated as unjust in other parts of the Bible. So in my Bible, the parable is titled The Dishonest Manager, but it's probably more accurately the unjust manager. And he is being unjust, or at least he was unjust, by choosing himself over the welfare of his neighbors for much of his life, by throwing out every rule of justice found in the laws of Moses that forbid lending money with interest. By getting richer and richer off of the backs of these working people, he is moving further and further from the just love of God that God ordains be present in a godly community. By trading God's law of justice for the world's unjust laws of greed, he is moving away from God's community of justice and bowing at the feet of an idol of money. His actions are pointing towards his values, and one cannot serve two masters. When he is offering these predatory loans, of course, the love of God cannot be present in his relationships with people, which is a shame because God desperately wants to be in our relationships with one another. But the manager isn't choosing that at that time. He is pushing God aside for something else. And that's how he lives his whole life until one day he finds out that he's going to be losing his job, and he realizes that greed and comfort that he has placed his trust in all those years will not be saving him after all. Instead, he finds out that he has been wrong this whole time. He repents and turns back to the way of God. He decides that his comfort or money is actually not as important as being in relationship with his community and with God. When the manager is called into his boss's office after he has forgiven the loans, you would think that his boss would be upset, but what can he do? The loans have been forgiven, and he knows that the manager has acted wisely. He returned to the way of God while he still could. And we don't know what this landowner, how this landowner runs his businesses there on out. Maybe he doesn't loan money with interest anymore. Maybe he gives generously out of what he has been blessed with. Maybe he keeps on the same thing, doing what he's always done. But he does at least acknowledge that this was the right move. It is wise or shrewd, which is just another way of saying it is of God. And all of this has me thinking about my friend at the bar and the respect and love he shared for the priests that were in his life. Because those priests chose justice when it was hard. They were faithful. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? This parable is for sure about money. For sure. It is a text about being generous with the gifts of God that are not ours to hoard. Of course it is. Jesus talks about money and the dangers of greed more than almost anything in the whole Bible. But the reason behind that shrewd wise, or godly use of money is a call back to the way of God. It is a beacon toward faithfulness, with the promise of true treasures. My friend's priest could have, I'm sure, chosen comfort. They could have kept their mouths shut and their heads down. I'm sure they could have sided with the government. I'm also sure that people wouldn't have been that surprised if they did, because not everybody was so brave. But they chose what was right. They chose the way of God that is always guiding toward love and community and away from greed and idolatry. And because they made that choice, because they were faithful with what they had, because they chose the way of God, my friend's eyes and the way he held them close in his heart, even after many, many years, told me that they had both given and received true treasures of heaven. Let us be a people who steward our gifts well, who are faithful and generous with what we have, even at the risk of our own discomfort, so that we can enjoy the treasures of God's way of love and justice in the eyes and hearts of one another. To the glory of God. Amen.